In America, the mailman stops by once a day, 6 days a week. But moving the U.S. mail is a mammoth, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week endeavor. When a letter is mailed, it joins over 600 million pieces of mail to and from destinations all over the nation and the world that are handled every day by the U.S. Postal Service. That is in excess of 40% of the entire world's mail volume. Your letter is then transferred by one of the Postal Service's 200,000 motor vehicles to its first stop, one of 40,000 United States post offices. It takes a workforce of 800,000 people to keep the mail moving, making the Postal Service the largest civilian employer in the U.S. Your letter, along with countless others headed for 128 million addresses in the U.S. alone, is first fed into the culling machine, which separates out thicker or odd-shaped envelopes for manual sorting. Then it's on to this machine. Its function is to cancel the postage stamps and then sort the letters into groups, according to the direction which the stamp is facing. Next, this machine. It's equipped with a small camera that actually reads the zip code of the addressee. That zip code is then sprayed onto the envelope in the form of a barcode. Then, this machine sorts the letters into general zip code destinations. All the letters for that general destination are then boxed and sealed. A computer designates each box for a specific airline flight. The next stop is the airport, where your letter is put on board one of 15,000 Postal Service and private carrier flights, carrying the U.S. mail each day. Upon arrival at its destination, your letter and the others are placed into another sorting machine that reads the barcode, determining to which local post office each should be sent. At that local post office, that same type of machine sorts your letter right down to the delivery route order for the letter carrier who will complete the delivery.
We provide a universal service at a uniform price. Now that means that we deliver to every address in the United States every day, 6 days a week, all year long. We're the only company that does that.
But where did this amazing process begin? What are today's roots of the Postal Service? The first form of writing we know of is the 5,000-year-old symbols of the Sumerians of Mesopotamia. This basic written communication, called cuneiform, evolved into a phonetic alphabet by about 2000 BC. With this advancement, more complex ideas could be conveyed, and the many peoples of Mesopotamia began to adopt the method of writing correspondences on clay tablets, which were sent by runners to their destinations. These runners are the earliest known postal messengers. Such a method was, of course, not secure in cases where secret messages needed to be delivered. Legend tells of one rather unusual method credited to Persian royalty in the mid-6th century BC.
A sender of a letter would take one of his slaves and shave his head and tattoo the message into his head and hold him incommunicado until his hair grew out, and then whisper in his ear, "It's to go to Joe's." And then the messenger would go to Joe's. At that point, they'd shave his head and read the message.
The well-maintained paved roads of ancient Rome were built primarily for the movement of military troops and messages. But ancient government postal services were not for use by the populace. They were reserved for the official business of royalty. However, in 1100 AD, Kublai Khan created a system in China that lasted 600 years and was available to all. A chain of 10,000 post offices served the kingdom, all in communication with each other via horseman and boat. As the Middle Ages came to an end in Europe, most countries maintained some kind of postal operation. European monarchs in the 16th century, such as England's King Henry VIII, were so concerned with the mail being transported properly and rapidly that they set harsh penalties for failure.
If you miscarried the mail, you might forfeit your life, or you might forfeit a significant percentage of your salary, so much so that your family would perish in the process. In fact, if you look at some European letters, there's a design device that's actually the stylized image of a gallows to remind the letter carrier that if he delayed the mail, he forfeited his life.
A century later, another British king broke with tradition and opened the Royal Mail Service to the masses.
King Charles needed some extra revenues, and he saw a way of getting those revenues in by freeing up the post to the general public.
In 1639, the first official post office appeared in British North America. It was in the Fairbanks Tavern in Boston, so chosen because it was a common meeting place for the people and for its location on the wharf, where mail arrived from overseas. Those ships took as long as a month to journey to and from England. Friends, merchants, or Native American messengers usually carried unofficial mail within the colonies. The colonists established a central postal organization in 1691. Its rights were purchased by the Crown in 1707 when it was determined that there was a profit to be made from the operation. John Hamilton was then appointed First Deputy Postmaster General of America. Hamilton's most notable achievement may have come in 1737 with the naming of Benjamin Franklin, a 31-year-old struggling printer and publisher, to the position of Postmaster of Philadelphia. Franklin rose to the position of Deputy Postmaster General in 1753. Franklin immediately set out to reorganize the service. He mapped out new and shorter postal loads, complete with milestone markers. Also, he scheduled night runs for postal riders between Philadelphia and New York, cutting travel time in half. In the year 1792, there were 75 post offices in the U.S., each serving about 43,000 customers. By the early 1800s, postal officials realized that transportation was the key to mail delivery for a growing nation. So the post office helped to develop and subsidize every new mode of transport introduced into the U.S. Stagecoaches were employed to carry mail on the better post roads, and steamboats were contracted for mail delivery to places where no roads existed.
In 1792, post office really consisted of little more than a single string of offices from Maine to Georgia. By 1800, it had become a network of about 800. By 1831, you had about 10,000.
By 1840, there were more than 13,000 post offices serving an average of 1,100 patrons each. The post office's growth and development was of great benefit to the population centers on the East Coast. However, America was expanding westward, and with the discovery of gold in California in 1849, the pioneer movement began to boom. It took a hardy, adventurous spirit to brave the move west, and it was men of that same spirit who were entrusted with getting the U.S. mail through to the settlers of the new frontiers. As a result of America's booming westward expansion of the mid-1800s, the U.S. Post Office Department employed large ships to carry mail from the East Coast to California.
The most favored route was down the east coast to the Isthmus of Panama, across by ox cart, and then north by clipper ship to the west coast. The trip across the Isthmus took approximately 6 weeks.
The alternative was a 3-month journey around the tip of South America. But there was another way. The Old West was served by many private express companies, some small, some large, but none rivaled Wells Fargo. For all intents and purposes, American rail and telegraph service stopped at the Missouri River, and so did the U.S. Post Office.
And that was one signal failure of the post office in the 19th century. The government did a very good job of extending service to Michigan and to the Southwest, the old Southwest, Arkansas, Texas, and so on, but it had great trouble in California. And it was there that entrepreneurs like Wells and Fargo really saw their opening.
Not only gold miners were making fortunes in California, express companies were commonly charging 3 to 5% of the value of a gold shipment to send it back east. The total value of the gold shipped in 1851 alone was $60 million. Henry Wells and William Fargo opened their freighting and banking company in San Francisco in 1852. By 1855, through buyouts, consolidation, and good luck, Wells Fargo was the only game in town. The post office in the western reaches of the U.S. was virtually non-existent, so Wells Fargo began supplying Californians with private overland mail service to the east. The familiar dark green letterboxes of Wells Fargo were a common sight on the streets of California towns, and were sometimes brazenly placed directly next to the red U.S. post boxes. With its 1,500 horses and 150 stagecoaches, Wells Fargo handled more mail in the West than did the post office.
In California, they actually monopolized the letter-carrying business from the 1840s right up until the 1880s. If you were living in California, you felt that Wells Fargo was doing a much better job than the post office.
It was even said that in the West, Wells Fargo was the post office. But even with the best efforts of Wells Fargo and other express companies, mail rarely reached California in fewer than 23 days. Speed remained the enemy of mail delivery. In 1860, the border of the western frontier of the U.S. was the Missouri town of St. Joseph. In March of that year, the giant freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell set out to prove that a team of couriers on horseback, cutting straight through the heart of the West, could beat all other express services' best times, and do so convincingly. They set up a string of 100 relay and home stations for the riders along the nearly 2,000-mile route from St. Joseph to Sacramento, California, with riverboat service continuing into San Francisco.
Relay stations were every 10 to 15 miles, and they would change horses at every relay station, and then they would change riders at every home station. Generally, home stations were established locations, very likely stagecoach stops, whereas the relay stations would be far more primitive.
When the rider arrived at a relay station, as soon as he dismounted, he would hop on a fresh horse and continue. Riders covered as much as 100 miles in a day. The schedule allowed for just 10 days to complete a run between San Francisco and Missouri. The Pony Express riders beat the best time of the overland stage by more than half.
There is a famous poster which is quoted as saying, wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred.
The pay was $50 a month. The riders included Bronco Charlie Miller, only 11 years old, and 14-year-old William Cody, later to be known internationally as Buffalo Bill. They carried nearly 38,000 pieces of mail, a combined distance equal to 24 times around the earth. Just one shipment was ever lost, and only one rider was killed.
Billy Tate, he was killed by Indians, but the horse continued on in. The riders had the finest horse flesh available. They did not use sidearms to try and protect themselves, except if they absolutely had to. They relied on the horse to simply outrun the trouble.
Following the closing of the final link in a transcontinental telegraph, the last rider on the last run handed over the mail in California, and the Pony Express slipped into legend just 19 months after it had begun. It was about this time that the post office's use of trains for mail delivery changed dramatically. An experiment with a so-called Railroad Post Office, or RPO, on a route from Washington, D.C. to New York, from which mail was sorted and distributed, was a great success. Use of RPOs greatly improved speed and efficiency of mail delivery by eliminating the need for stops at train depots along the line to sort the local mail. The sacks of mail for a given town were tossed from the moving train. Specially made arms held outgoing mail bags, which were snared by the train as it flew by the station. By 1930, more than 10,000 train routes were being used to move the mail to every big city and hamlet in the U.S.
And you had a team of very highly skilled men, they were all men, and they sorted the mail for the entire United States. That's why big city post offices were located next to railway stations. It was a moving system. It was inconceivable with the stagecoaches, and it's inconceivable with airplanes today.
The last RPO made its final run on June 30th, 1977. Increasing loss of ridership over the years to airlines was a major factor in the decision. Through the early 1800s, postal customers had the option of having the recipient of the letter pay the postage fee. The problem was that the addressee often refused to pay, thus refusing the letter. In such a case, the post office's labor and delivery costs were never recovered. In 1840, the British Royal Mail introduced the idea of prepayment of postage with an adhesive label known as the penny black. The U.S. followed the British lead and introduced the 5-cent Benjamin Franklin stamp and the 10-cent George Washington stamp in 1847. In 1855, prepayment of postage became mandatory in the United States. Convenience for the postal customer was increased with the appearance of letterboxes on street corners in 1858. As the 1800s neared an end, a new Postmaster General with insightful ideas for the future took office. He realized that population growth in the U.S. and its continuing shift westward were creating a steadily increasing workload for the post office. He also realized that people alone could not be expected to keep up with this tremendous growth. Modernization was the key. In 1790, the U.S. mail consisted of about 1,000 letters per day. By 1890, the nation's 150,000 postal workers were handling 8,000 letters per minute. John Wanamaker became the Postmaster General in 1889. While he praised the accomplishments of the U.S. Post Office Department in its first 100 years, he pointed out that the way the mail was handled had remained virtually unchanged for a century. Wanamaker's goal to make the mails go faster, more safely, and more frequently was to dominate the work of the post office during his term. But Wanamaker had even greater plans for the post office.
He did help to speed the mails. He was an extraordinarily ambitious man in his business dealings and as Postmaster General. He helped to promote rural free delivery.
Although it did not become available until after Wanamaker left office in 1893, rural free delivery was finally instituted just before the turn of the 20th century. More than 50% of America's population lived in farming regions. Those people, too, now receive their daily mail free of charge, a service that had been enjoyed in urban areas for decades.
But he was unsuccessful in his three most ambitious ventures. He wanted the government to take over the telegraph, he wanted the government to take over the telephone, and he wanted the government to institute a parcel post. And in all three of those ventures, he was blocked by powerful business groups.
Prior to 1892, all U.S. postage stamps were basically uniform in design, mostly featuring the likenesses of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. Wanamaker decided to try something fresh and new. To celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World, the post office issued a series of commemorative postage stamps. Congress criticized the idea, but Wanamaker defended the stamps, saying they could become moneymakers for the post office. He was right. Today, there is a wide interest in commemorative stamps, sparked in part by the 1993 release of the Elvis Presley stamp.
The commemorative stamps that we do are a benefit to the Postal Service. We're at $280 million a year on commemorative stamps, and we consider that's going to continue to grow.
Many of these stamps go right into private collections, much to the delight of the Postal Service, which profits from the sale of the stamp but never incurs the cost of delivering a letter. As early as 1877, the U.S. Post Office began to use machines to cancel stamps, replacing the manual method.
One of the earliest innovators of canceling machines in this country was Thomas Leavitt from Massachusetts. They had their limitations. They could only cancel postal cards because of their uniform size, but they were very efficient.
Leavitt's hand-crank machine could cancel 15,000 postcards in 1 hour. The most adept postal worker could only hope to hand-cancel 2,000 in an hour. Other companies introduced belt-driven and then electric canceling machines in the following decades. By 1920, the post office owned and operated nearly 3,000 canceling machines. Experiments in automated sorting of mail began at the main post office in Washington, D.C. in 1907.
These early innovations were not as productive as they should have been. A lot of things would jam. They weren't as speedy as you might think. They relied on somebody sitting there with a keyboard kind of mechanism that didn't always work. You know, first steps don't always work. You trip and you fall. But in the course of tripping and falling, you learn how to walk. In this case, walking would come a little later. In the 1950s, we really begin to take our first unfettered steps.
Another romantic era in the history of mail delivery was about to dawn, one that would ultimately capture the attention and fire the imagination of the entire world. The next great frontier for the post office was the skies. A quite unusual method for delivery of mail through the air was proposed in 1801 by a German newspaper editor. The plan was to fire hollow mortar shells filled with mail from town to town. His idea died on the drawing board. Englishman Captain Walter Wyndham is credited with organizing the first official delivery of mail by airplane. Wyndham, a motor car producer and racer who was enamored with aviation, sold his business and booked passage to India with 2 pilots and 8 airplanes in tow.
Walter Wyndham was one of those visionaries that appeared at the early days of aviation, a man who could see the future, and he threw his life and his fortune into promoting the interests of aviation.
A clergyman who hoped to raise money to build a new hostel approached Captain Wyndham and suggested that by inaugurating an aerial post, funds could be raised. The challenge was perfectly suited for the ambitious aviator, and the world's first airmail flight took off on February 18th, 1911. Just 7 months later, the U.S. Post Office's first experimental airmail flight took off from Long Island, New York. There were more experimental flights in the following years, but congressional support was slow in coming. In 1918, Congress appropriated the needed $100,000 for the first official airmail routes, using pilots and planes supplied by the Army. The pilots called those first planes flying coffins because of the dangers involved with flying them.
The instrumentation that the early airmail pilots had were basically an unreliable compass, an airspeed meter, an altimeter, and a revolution counter for the engine. It is nothing short of a miracle that they were able to perform at the level they did, given these crude instruments.
Thousands of spectators converged on Washington, D.C.'s Potomac Park on May 15, 1918, to witness the historic first official postal flight to New York City by way of Philadelphia. President Woodrow Wilson presented engraved watches as commemorative gifts for the pilots flying the various legs of the route. Postal workers loaded mail bags into pilot Lieutenant George Boyle's plane, and he took off into the late morning sky to the cheers of the crowd. For 9 years, the post office operated the flights. In that period, out of the roughly 400 pilots that flew the mail, 34 died in crashes, mostly as a result of bad weather.
It should be noted that at this time the pilots did not wear parachutes. Pilots voted against wearing them, in large part because it was their job to save the mail. And if they jumped out of the airplane, the mail was lost.
America's new love affair with aviation turned to obsession with the first transatlantic flight, New York to Paris, by former airmail pilot Charles Lindbergh in May of 1927. But Lindbergh knew that he alone did not deserve the world's adulation.
Lindbergh once said that he provided the match to the bonfire, and that people tended to mistake the light of the match for the light of the bonfire, and I think that's true. The bonfire was the pioneering work of the airmail service.
The Post Office Department closed down its airmail operations in 1927. Private air carriers were awarded government contracts to carry the U.S. mail. Such was the beginning of commercial aviation. To this day, all regular U.S. mail is flown under contract by private airlines. The Postal Service does, though, maintain a fleet of planes to fly shipments of urgent delivery mail.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When America entered World War II, one of the post office's most important concerns was providing mail service to the armed forces scattered over the globe. The U.S. War and Navy departments encouraged letter writing between service personnel overseas and loved ones back home, stating that frequent and rapid communication strengthens fortitude, enlivens patriotism, and makes loneliness endurable. To cut down on the tremendous amount of space taken up on military planes and ships by sacks of mail to and from service personnel, V-mail was introduced in June of 1942. V standing for victory. The post office encouraged that all letters to and from those in the military overseas be written on special letter forms that were then photographed onto microfilm. The film, not the bulky letters, was then sent overseas to military post offices. 183,000 microfilm letters could travel in a container the size of a hatbox.
At that point, microfilm would be used to produce a small photographic replica of the letter, and that would be what the serviceman or servicewoman would receive out in the field. It saved tremendous volumes of mail. It was not an American idea. It was actually a British idea. The idea was brilliance, absolute brilliance.
More than 1.25 million V-mail letters were sent from June 1942 until September 1945. To ensure proper delivery of mail overseas, U.S. military post offices did not have names. They had numbers. Also, mailing addresses used by service personnel contained their serial numbers. Inspired by the efficiency of using a number system, in 1943 the U.S. Post Office Department developed postal zone coding for use of the country's 124 largest post offices. The 1 or 2 digit zone designation corresponded to the post office station from which letter carriers emanated. The result was fewer mail delivery errors. An improved system of coding mail which assigned each address in the United States a specific 5-digit code was introduced in 1963. The ZIP or Zoning Improvement Plan code tells the post office in which of 10 U.S. regions an address is located, as well as the major city or large area of population, and the local post office destination. The post office used the animated character Mr. Zip in a promotional blitz for the new system. In 1983, the zip code was amended with the addition of 4 numbers, which could pinpoint an addressee down to, for example, a particular floor in an office building. The speed and accuracy of mail delivery were greatly improved by use of the zip code. But for a postal system desperately in need of change, disaster was on the horizon, and eventually, rebirth. Years of financial neglect and management inefficiency combined with outmoded facilities and low wages for workers caught up with the post office in the mid-1960s.
What happened was the total collapse of the Postal Service, and most people now don't know that. But the Chicago Post Office, our largest post office, literally failed to process mail. Literally millions of pieces of mail were left stranded because the system was overloaded and could not process the mail. And at that point, the Postal Service itself had to say, we're in a race with catastrophe unless we change.
A basic reorganization of the Post Office Department was proposed by Postmaster General Winton Blount in 1969. It was approved and signed into law by President Richard Nixon on July 1st, 1971.
It took a politically bloated system where patronage was rampant, where pay for letter carriers and clerks was deplorable, where mail volumes were astronomical, but the ability to process the mail was ridiculously poor. It transformed all that into a much more efficient system that was much more humane.
With Nixon's signature, the old Post Office Department ceased to exist, and the new United States Postal Service officially began operations as a private government corporation, operated not under the authority of the U.S. Congress, but of a board of governors and Postal Service executives. Also, authorization was given for collective bargaining with postal employee unions. In the Old West, eager and well-equipped private express companies like Wells Fargo provided a serious direct challenge to the U.S. Post Office. Today, the modern U.S. Postal Service is once again being seriously challenged by a private industry that looks to have staked its claim to the global business arena. Companies such as Federal Express, DHL, and the world's largest United Parcel Service continue to dominate in the market for urgent delivery of mail and packages, domestically and worldwide. Urgent delivery refers to rapid, often overnight, guaranteed delivery of an item. UPS alone transports more than 3 billion parcels and documents annually in the U.S. and to over 200 other countries, utilizing fleets of 147,000 motor vehicles and over 500 aircraft. That makes UPS the largest airline in the world. To compete, the U.S. Postal Service has in recent years introduced its own urgent domestic and international delivery services, such as Priority Mail, domestic 2-day delivery, express mail, guaranteed domestic overnight delivery, and a guaranteed international service called Global Priority Mail.
Competition has helped to redefine the Postal Service by waking us up to the need to change. There's nothing like a fit competitor to get yourself fit. And so competition is challenging us to be ever better and ever more productive.
Even though the private express companies are doing a tremendous business, they pale in comparison with the U.S. Postal Service when it comes to volume. In one day, the U.S. Postal Service delivers more letters and packages than does Federal Express in a year, and in 3 days, what UPS delivers annually. Tremendous growth in mail volume marked the prosperity of the 1980s in America. The 1990s proved to be a challenge of another kind for the Postal Service. Downsizing of companies and the increasing use of fax machines, email, and electronic banking have resulted in a measurable decrease in the use of first-class mail service. To guide the Postal Service into the new frontier and the next century, Marvin Runyon, a former automobile executive at Ford and at Nissan, as well as former head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, was appointed Postmaster General in 1992. Runyon knew that technology was the key to competing successfully.
It's the most critical thing we've got. New technology is moving in and really taking our business away from us. The Postal Service has more competitors than I ever dreamed of in the automotive business, and a lot of it is because of new technologies.
In 1996, Runyon spent $900 million on updated postal automation and committed another $2.6 billion for the coming years. Customer service is where the Postal Service sees itself leading the pack with a worldwide website that allows the purchasing of stamps, a way to look up any zip code in the U.S., and a postage calculator. The U.S. Postal Service, as well as postal departments in other countries, is working to integrate traditional services with a new technology. For example, the marriage of email and standard letter mail.
Nowadays, over 75% of letters and documents actually start on a computer. We're now able to take that information straight down the telephone line to our electronic mail centres in the UK, where we can then print and envelope that mail and insert it into the mailing system. Somebody in the US can send us their mailing information downline, and as long as we receive it by 6 p.m. London time, we will get that into the system for delivery the next morning. So you're looking at about a 16-hour delivery span.
40 centuries of evolution and mail delivery has brought us to the dawn of electronic communication. Immediate paperless transfer of information that some are convinced will replace traditional mail in America. There are, however, certain things that high-tech innovations can never replace.
Delivery of mail in the future will always be there because, you know, these emails, they're nice, but you can't send chocolate chip cookies from mom through an email. You can't get a perfumed letter from someone you really care about through the email. You can't get a letter from your granddaughter sort of scrawled out through email. It's going to still require the Postal Service. We're going to be here.
Public expectations and the demands of business are increasing. If history is a guide to meet those needs, technology will improve, and competition will intensify. These will define the role of mail delivery services and determine their viability in the 21st century.